First, thank you again, Gunther, for this fantastic introduction to the environment of Elam, to the nature and the resources. The first question that Anne also is used to, I think, ask everyone who's coming here: how did you yourself come to study this subject? So tell us a little bit about your own becoming a specialist of Elam and Achaemenid Persia.
Yes, but I think I have audio. Can you hear me? Elamite studies and even Achaemenid studies, or even ancient Iranian studies, is not something that you answer when you're 7 and people ask you, what do you want to become? However, I always was interested in history and ancient languages. And as you may know, I come from Holland. Alex was mentioning it. And we still have a traditional system in Holland of schools with Greek and Latin. So from 12 onwards, I had 6 years of quite intensive Greek and Latin. It basically was the only thing we had. Biology or math or anything was not important. You just did Greek and Latin the whole day. And I fell completely in love with that ancient world. And I didn't want to separate from it. So,
yeah, is it better? Okay, good.
Is this better? Yes, I think it's better.
Yeah, so when I went for my university education, I didn't want to separate from this ancient world that I had become so familiar with. So I went for classical philology in the University of Leiden, Greek and Latin again. And I wouldn't say it was a disappointment, but it was not the same as it had been in school, where I was completely open to this new literature and this faraway world. But it was not exactly what I had expected. It was too much concentrated, I thought, on ancient Greece and Rome. And we read a lot of ancient texts, like Herodotus, that I cited for you today. And as you know, Herodotus talks about ancient Persia, but our professors didn't tell us about ancient Persia. So I became curious. I wanted to know more about this hidden world in the East. And then by good fortune, I met a person, Helene Sanchisi-Weerdenburg, who was a professor of ancient history and specialized in ancient Persia in my second year in university. And she invited me to join her in her studies of Achaemenid history. And that basically was when I saw the light. And back then, to finish the story, it was possible to do 2 master degrees at the same time in Holland. So I finished classical philology, Greek and Latin, and I made a second master, which was ancient Iranian studies, with a special focus on Achaemenid culture and history. And Helene always encouraged everybody to learn things that she didn't know. So one of the first things she encouraged me to do was to learn Elamite, because she had already understood how important it was for the Persian Empire. And suddenly I was a specialist of Elamite, and I got a job for it. So that's the story.
Professor, I've been reading a little bit ever since I was dedicated to some work on this roundtable. And through whatever I've read, I've come to some conclusions which I would like to place in front of you to either refute or to correct or whatever. One was that what I gather in all my reading that I've done in the past month or so is that if you look at the Bisuddin engravings or anywhere, it points to the fact that the Achaemenians were Zoroastrian, but it points to a kind of federalism or a savvy political situation. For instance, they did not impose a single language. Out of respect, they called the subjugated nations, they called them other nations. They didn't call them Iran or Persia. And they had an administrative model which allowed those principalities or kingdoms to function independently with an overarching administrative model, so a pyramidal structure. Later we see the British did pretty much the same thing in India. When they realized that they couldn't govern a large country, they allowed 252 princely states to continue to look after the administration of their kingdoms as long as they paid their taxes and they agreed to the same foreign policy. but they didn't interfere in their day-to-day running. So it seems like this model was prevalent in large empires. The engravings point to the fact that they were multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilinguistic, and very tolerant. There's also a reference to rebellion in Babylon against the taxation system in Darius's time, and they very quickly squelched that by changing the tax and agreeing to a tax reform. So what I see through all of this is a very political savvy kind of situation. There was religious tolerance, there was acceptance of languages, of different faiths, of different deities. So they were pragmatic, politically savvy, and they didn't have a state religion as such, maybe. And because they were tolerant, maybe, again, this is my conclusion, maybe that is why they were seen as less Zoroastrian. The other thing was that
maybe for the audience it would be useful if I answer the first part of your question now. Thank you. Which was already a complicated and long question, so let me try to address the various parts of it. Yes, not only was the Achaemenid Empire, as you very well put it, a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious, multicultural empire, but the Achaemenid kings made an explicit case of this rich nature of the Achaemenid Empire. They made it into an argument. They made the many languages of the empire and the many nations that made up the empire an argument for their universal rule. So it is not a coincidence of the empire that they had many languages and many people, but it was an essential argument for the empire that it encompassed the whole world. The whole known world, the whole known human universe was under the King of Kings. And in every inscription you find this expressed in multiple ways, but also in other parts of Achaemenid culture. You see it in one striking example, and I come back to my teacher, Helene Sanchizi, was Persian cuisine in the time of the Persian kings, of the Achaemenid kings. They had tables that served food from all over the known world. Spices from Ethiopia, but also from India. Ingredients from Bactria, wine from far away, dishes that were complicated and made from ingredients that would not normally be found in one region. A real haute cuisine, as you would call it, and a very imperial cuisine that had as a purpose to show the unendless diversity and might of the Persian king. So this is very true. This is essential. They didn't have a state religion in the sense that they imposed their religion on subject people or even expected their, let's say, administrators in Egypt or Bactria to be part of that religion. And it's a very interesting thought that because of this pragmatism, I would call it pragmatism and not tolerance necessarily, their own fate became less visible in the sources that we have. I think this is probably partly true. But it is also probably partly true that the Achaemenid kings, in their definition of kingship, and in a sense of sacred kingship, and in their definition of their relation with Ara Mazda, as you find it in the inscriptions, probably played a critical role in the formation of Zoroastrianism. And this is actually a turn that the scholarship is now taking, not just me, and I should say by far not just me, but for instance my colleague Albert de Jong, professor of comparative religion in Leiden, who specializes in ancient Zoroastrianism, as you may know, he starts now working exactly on this thesis, and he recently wrote a paper in which he says, maybe we should not ask only what Zoroastrianism meant for the King of Kings, but we should also ask what the King of Kings meant for early Zoroastrianism. I think the impulse is two ways, and I think that is exactly what we're seeing in the early Achaemenid reign. I hope that answers at least part of your multivariate question.
Yeah. Is that the same divine theory of kingship translated into the English Church of England?
Well, there's, of course, there's this very interesting, empires are very interesting animals. They are, empires, as strange as it may sound, I mean, we are all accustomed, of course, to discourses about imperial colonialism and the consequences and the way the world looks nowadays, by and large, is a result of that. But on the other hand, there is something to be said for the thesis that empires are soft powers in comparison to nation states. Nation states can impose a single language and a single religion. They can impose cultural uniformity. France tried to do that in France by, for instance, suppressing minority languages like Breton. So there's certainly a case to be made for nation states to be more intrusive in the life of citizens, and empires simply don't have the means to do that. Even if they wanted to do that, they wouldn't be able to do that. So that's one aspect of empire. And then as opposed to that sort of soft power, empires need something emblematic. They need something that unifies the idea of empire. A nation state is a mental construct, but if that is true, an empire is even more a mental construct. An empire exists because people want it to exist. And they want it to exist because they believe in a central idea that defines that empire. So for the Achaemenids, as for the British Empire, of course, there must be a kind of mission. So I do really believe, whatever label you want to put on it, that the Achaemenids had a kind of mission in their empire. And I would actually, to answer a point that you mentioned before, the sort of relative autonomy that you were mentioning of the different provinces or satrapies, I think that's actually quite relative, because the Persians did bring a lot of organization. For instance, in Bactria and in Arachosia, we know that there was complicated bureaucracies were put in place. Aramaic script was introduced, even Elamite was brought there, use of seals, hierarchies, production sites, and whatever. And I think apart from mere profit or control or such things, part of that mission was also exactly the order that they were imposing. And if you start to think about that, then you can also make the connection back to the royal inscriptions, where our master is invoked as the creator, who creates the universe as a perfect harmony with the happiness, shiati, as you know, for people as like the epitome of the creation. And then it transfers to the king, who is the mirror image of the god, and who also organizes and in a way creates the Persian Empire as a reflection, as an earthly reflection of the work of our master. So I think all this bureaucracy and organizing and transporting and making roads and securing travelers and such things, I mean, I don't want to overestimate it, but I think there's a case to be made for Persians thinking of this as a mission of empire to create order in the world. So I hope that answers more or less what you were asking.
Thank you very much for all the scholarly work that you have done in this regard, and really shed light on part of the history of Iran, which is so dear to all Iranians and Zoroastrian in particular. So in that regard, I think it's good to mention that the Zoroastrians and the Iranians / Zoroastrians in general believe that, or disbelieve that the Achaemenians were Zoroastrians and saw all the glories of the Achaemenian achievements is associated with Zoroastrianism and teachings of Zarathustra. However, when now we get this new look at the history through the archaeologists, now we see that, well, there are many things related to the Achaemenians that we didn't know, and we are still looking for that. So in that regard, I think we have a good teachings from the Zarathustra himself, that throughout the Gatha, he says, he urges everybody to seek knowledge, to look at the facts, ponder upon that with your good mind, good thoughts, and then make the decision, choose for yourself. The same way he says that, listen to what I have to say, ponder upon that with your good mind, and choose freely your own path. So, in light of that, I think we all should appreciate, the kind of works that archaeologists like yourself are doing to give us with the truth and look at different aspects of it. Our history, as we well know, the history of pre-Islamic Iran, pretty much we don't know anything about that, but whatever which is written by the Greeks contemporaries. And after Islam, all the historians are referring to the same thing which was written by the Greeks. So in that regard, I think one of the things to regard that is that the history is said to be written by Greeks. And this is the history that we have from Iran. Right? So with that in mind, my question is that, how do you see the work that you do, the discoveries that you do? You can reconcile that with, the things that Greek historians have told about the history of that time. For instance, one of the things that we know is that Zoroaster lived way before the Achaemenid time. So it's a good thing to think that at the time of the Achaemenids, the old language, the old teaching of Zarathustra was forgotten, and the whole teachings, Zarathustra was against all these gods and all of the things that we know, but we know that some of that may have been got back into the religion. So at the time of the Achaemenids, yes, there were parts that were practicing Zoroastrians. Some of the kings may have the Zoroastrianism as their religion, but adopted some of the other things like that. So all of these things are things that we have to think about that, I think.
Yes.
I wanted to see that. What is your thoughts on that?
This panel discussion is full of very complicated questions. So let me try to address some of the issues that you were raising. First, about the Greek sources. So as Alex can confirm, he and I, we basically are the second generation of a group of scholars that try to readdress the Achaemenid Empire and its culture in a different light, in a Persian perspective, away from the Greek sources. That never means ignoring the Greek sources. Never. It's a big misunderstanding to say that we don't regard the Greek sources. We do. We just don't think that they are primary sources. We think that primary sources about the Achaemenid Empire can only come from Iran. Even if those primary sources are not of the nature that we would like them to be. We don't have a Persian Herodotus. So be it. There's a great historian, Sir Moses Finlay, who said about such problems, lack of evidence, he said, that is a pity, not an argument. Yeah? So that's just how it is. We don't have a Persian Herodotus, but we have the fortification archive. We have Achaemenid art, and we have now more of it than we had 50 years ago, thanks to the archive. Both text and glyptic, we have much more. The glyptic art from the Persepolis archive is larger than Greek red figure vase painting as a corpus. It's enormous. It's enormous. We really know a lot now about Achaemenid art thanks to these new finds. So what we will do, we as a group, I think we all have the same goal. We want to construct a new image, a new perspective for Achaemenid history based on primary Achaemenid Iranian sources, but we will integrate into that new building the Greek sources. And we will try to read them in a new way, in a new light. So when, for instance, I cited Herodotus as saying that the Persians have no temples and no statues, of course the question is, if they have temples and if they have statues, what to do with Herodotus? Should we throw him away? No, we should try to understand him. In the time of Herodotus, at the place that he was writing, which is in Athens around 430 or 420 BC, there was a lively discussion about the nature of the gods. The Greeks were interested in the question, are the gods having a human shape or not? Should we imagine them as traditionally has been the case? Should we make statues for them? Do gods live in a house? Do they live in a temple? Or is this too human focused, this imagination? Are the gods not too big for this? And Persia served as a kind of imaginative land on which Greek philosophers and writers like Herodotus could project their kind of ideal idea of religion. So an abstract religion with no altars and no statues and no temples was what they thought of as more natural. So whereas the Greek authors often are very negative about Persia, there's also this perspective where they think that the Persians are closer to nature, and they project all kinds of ideas on ancient Persia. So what Herodotus is saying is real, but it is real in a Greek context. It doesn't necessarily say all that much about ancient Persia. So it is interesting, and we should study it. We should simply not take it as our first source. It's as easy as that. Now moving on to the second part, which was about the nature of the religion and how we should call it and how we should see it in the longue durée. I mean, I dread this question simply because I'm not big enough a scholar to answer it, and also because the question is very complicated. It depends, among other things, of your definition of early Zoroastrianism. And it depends on your definition of the chronology of ancient Zoroastrianism, and I think everybody in the audience knows that this is discussed in scholarship. It's not something that everybody agrees on. So having said so, the only thing that, from the perspective that I am developing, I can add to this discussion, is that the perspective that the King of Kings, especially Darius, is developing in the royal inscriptions, the royal ideology, is not necessarily opposed to the image that you see in the tablets. In the tablets you see that many different gods are venerated, side by side. Some of them have an Iranian background. Some of them may be labeled as Zoroastrian. Some of them have Iranian names, but are not known in the Zoroastrian tradition. Many, actually. Most of the Iranian of the gods with Iranian names are not known in the Zoroastrian tradition. And then there's the Elamite gods, and some of the Elamite gods are actually very important. And not only is their cult continued, but for instance the ancient highland god Napi-Irisha, his cult is actually promoted and expanded towards the north under Darius. We can see that in the archive. So it's part of a heartland cultural system, and when that system is being enlarged, when it is expanding, this divine world is also expanding. So this is really very much part of the picture. I should also repeat that all these sacrifices are paid by the state. They are organized by the state, they are paid by the state, and they are documented by the state. So we cannot say, that this is a part of religion which was for private Elamite people besides Zoroastrians. All of this is the state. So what I think, and I think you gave part of the solution already, I think that especially ancient Zoroastrianism could be very open to this idea of looking at the world and, you know, apply wisdom in your judgment and apply moderation and pragmatism. And I think that the Achaemenid kings did very well in assuming that gods venerated in the heartland belonged to the heartland, whatever their background, and therefore sponsored their cult. That is a different question from the personal fate of the king, but I really don't think that what Darius is saying in the inscriptions is necessarily different from what you see in the tablets. It's two sides of the same coin, I think.
Thank you, Wouter. We want to open up the floor because you waited, I think, long enough also to ask your questions. To Wouter, this is your chance. He's going back to Chicago to read more tablets very soon.
Thank you very much for your perspective you have given us this morning. But essentially, it seems to go against the grain of most Zoroastrian beliefs that marrying the teachings of Zarathustra, which rejected the worship of any deities, any idols, any false gods, which the Magi's of the Achaemenids got from the Sistan Mohammeds, was combined with the experience as vassal kingdom of the Assyrians, where they noticed the power of the temples and the Achaemenid and the Ashur, which, as you know, is an ancient Egyptian emblem, which was adopted by the Assyrians. You're combining, when you combine the two and give your interpretations of the various tablets, including the carvings, seems to suggest that the Achaemenids introduced not Zoroastrianism into the state, but introduced the Elamite concept of the worship of various deities. Am I too far wrong away from that? And the second question also is related to that your repeated display of tablets and seals, which talked about the gifting of barley and sheep and goats, etc., to the temples, was essentially nothing to do with the religion of Zoroastrianism or what the Achaemenids practiced, but a compensation for the sustenance of the temples and the Magi's who ran their temples, and nothing much more than that. Am I completely wrong in this understanding?
Not at all. But as I said in my answer to the previous question, all really depends critically on your definition of ancient Zoroastrianism. And I think the question is even, or the reality is even more complicated than what I say now, because there may have been more than one strand of ancient Zoroastrianism. It is well possible that in certain circles there was a more orthodox version, and in other circles there was a less orthodox version. It may well be that a kind of Zoroastrianism was practiced or introduced in the Achaemenid state, but not to the extent that it could dominate the whole religious landscape. This is something that we simply do not know yet. I mean, I would like to have that answer, but I think that we would kill the discussion if we made a decision right now. So, one thing that I want to stress, in case I didn't make my point clear, I think that ancient Zoroastrianism, however you define it, is part of the Iranian experience, is part of the Iranian world. And I have shown you pictures of Iranian mountains and of water and of the land, exactly to demonstrate my intuitive approach, which is to put Zoroastrianism in this in this broader context and longer tradition. It doesn't mean that Zoroastrianism is not something specific and distinct in the Iranian experience, but of course it relates to matters, to phenomena, to experiences that you would also find in other parts of Iranian culture. So for me, Elamite culture is also an Iranian culture, simply because it is part of the longer tradition. And I think that these exchanges and these common experiences are what we should focus on now. And I think this, in turn,
maybe in one generation of scholarship will give us a clearer view of what Zoroastrianism may have been in the time of Darius and what it may have been in terms of significance for the Achaemenid state. But I would be, so please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that they were not Zoroastrians. I really don't know that. I think I would not be a good scholar if I was very adamant about that. I really don't know that. I just see that the religious landscape, the cultic landscape from the tablets, which is really one of the main sources, is much more varied and in certain ways also quite different from what we expected. But maybe that is simply because our expectations were not as fine-tuned as they could have been.
The only comment I have on that is that although the Elamites came from the southwest and the Sistan came from the southeast, you're saying that the effect of both was pretty heavy on the Assyrians. But the interpretation of the tablets from the Elamites seem to suggest that the influence as far as the religious tendencies were concerned, as far as the Achaemenids were concerned, was heavier to the Elamite element rather than the Sistan element. Would that be a...
Well, you know, it's true that I personally think that the Elamite element is quite important, simply in terms of volume in the tablets. But that doesn't mean that the what you call the Sistan element or the Eastern Iranian element is not important at all. On the contrary, and I think what you raise implicitly by pointing to Sistan is something very important because. As you know, we have difficulty placing the most ancient phase of Zoroastrianism and its cultural context, but I think that if anything, the archive, the Iranian gods in the archive do really point to an Eastern connection. But there are gods in it that did not survive in the later Zoroastrian tradition, so although they have Iranian names, I think this should really tell us something about the quite varied nature of the religious landscape. And just one more thing, again, to make myself clear, because I've been saying quite a lot and I'm not sure if it was coherent. When I stress that there's Elamite elements and there's Iranian or Zoroastrian elements, it doesn't mean that I think that it was a big soup in which everything was mixed and you couldn't recognize the elements anymore. I think it was a patchwork, but that patchwork, as such, was a unity that was accepted by the King of Kings. So I don't think that they necessarily wanted or tried to create religious unity, even in their heartland, simply because it wouldn't occur to their mind to do that. But that in itself can be a religious attitude, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Henkelman. Thank you for the panel and all the speakers. Great program. I don't want to ask a complicated question. There's plenty of that. Yeah. So I know what's burning in everybody's mind is why didn't the Holland football team didn't go to the World Cup?
Yes, I agree. I cannot sleep over it.
But also, I wanted to find out a little bit more about the third. You mentioned the Elamite gods, as well as the sacrifices that they made for Elamite gods, Zoroastrian gods, and then the others. I wanted to hear more about all the others, and if there's anything more you can tell us about that. Also, curious about the diet. Was the sacrifices and animal slaughter, was it an exception, perhaps, as the sacrifices, or was it a common thing that would take place?
Yeah, so I start with the second part of your question. I want to take you back to the point where I said that the religious landscape and cultic behavior as we see it in the tablets, of course, is very much embedded in an economic context. No source is ideal. And I mean, as much as I love the fortification archive, I would be the first to admit that its perspective is somehow limited, of course, to this
state economic context very clearly. So one aspect of that is that you don't easily kill animals for a very mundane economic reason. Animals are your main capital. So you preserve animals as much as you can, and you certainly wouldn't give animals to workers easily, except when you want to motivate them. So what they do, I'm now talking as an economic historian, or even materialist historian if you want. Not that I am, but I just try to be the devil's advocate. They sometimes make big sacrificial feasts to which they invite workers. These are dependent workers. They're not slaves. Slavery didn't play a big role, but the dependent laborers, let's say that they didn't have a fantastic life. They worked hard. But they would be motivated by their participation in such a feast. Now, for the king, the feast was a podium to show himself as a very generous ruler. And it was a podium for him to show himself as a very pious ruler. So everything would be under the umbrella of religion, but it would serve also an economic purpose. You see, so when we see animal sacrifices, it is often in such ideological contexts that are really clearly intended to stimulate, cohesion in the system. Having said so, certain gods do receive animal sacrifices, quite a lot of them actually, and some of these gods very clearly relate to the agricultural cycle, to rain, to fertility and such, so which I think connects them to a very deep past. I mean, rain is everything. It's really everything. We should really not underestimate that. I repeat, the people who made these sacrifices, who organized it, they were not theologians. They were embedded in a society that critically depended on the fertility of the land. So they were geared toward that question, very much. So the first part of the question, if I understood correctly, you were talking about the variety of gods, how many are there, or whatever. I think by now we have about 30. And we are pretty sure that these are not all of them, because many divinities seem to be hiding behind technical terms. So we have certain sacrifices that are known by the name of the sacrifice, but we don't know necessarily for which god the sacrifice is. And we have many sacrifices that are taking place on the top of a mountain or at a river, but they are not necessarily for the mountain. I believe that the mountain is a sacred space, but the mountain as such, I think, is not the destination of the sacrifice. You go to a mountain to sacrifice to a particular deity or to a group of deities. So, as I said, the material is not ideal. It doesn't describe what is Persian religion, but about 30 deities we have. They are all either Iranian in the sense that they have an Indo-Iranian name, or Elamite, in the sense that they have an Elamite name, or that they were venerated in the old kingdom of Elam for a long time. So we don't have, for instance, Egyptian gods, and we don't have real Babylonian gods. It's really only these two, and not by coincidence, of course, these two groups are what you have in the Achaemenid heartland. So it's not the gods of the empire, it's the gods of the heartland, and as such, by definition, I would say, in the eyes of the king, they are Persian, in the true sense of Persian, in the synthetic way of being Persian, which for me is something really beautiful and interesting, that they are so inclusive in their identity.
Yes, we have one more question.
Is this live? I just wanted you to elaborate on the timeline of the ancient religions that you talked about and Zoroastrianism. Because for us Iranians who were educated in Iran and are experts in history, ancient history, our knowledge of history really starts with Cyrus. And very little discussion of Zoroastrianism. And so the discussion that you had made me wonder, how do these two main streams, main trends, Zoroastrianism as we have known it and we have read about it, and the ancient religions, can we say at what time periods these developed and
Right.
were they coincidental or follow each other? If you would elaborate on that.
Sure, with pleasure. And but before answering, I should conclude that it's already very interesting to hear that you are now describing the ancient history of Iran as two strands rather than one. Because for too long, people have assumed, and sometimes for political reasons, that the history of Iran started with Cyrus the Great. But the history of Iran is much more varied than the history after Cyrus the Great. The history of Iran is incredible, and it's very, very old. It is so old that it loses itself in the distance of history. We cannot even trace it completely. So, to talk about the Elamite religion, we have Elamite texts starting from 2300 BC, but we know that the civilization is older. So from the material culture, we can go further back in time, but at some point, of course, it becomes uncertain if it is already Elamites or another population. So Elamite culture, let's say from the 3rd millennium onwards, so as a definable culture with a definable religion, it is the oldest that we have in Iran. And it existed down to the reign of Cyrus and Darius. And I personally believe that the kingdom of Elam, maybe as a vassal kingdom, existed under Cyrus and Cambyses, and that it was ended only under Darius. This is also the reason why there's no traces of Cyrus or Cambyses in Susa. The Achaemenid development of Susa starts with Darius. So the Elamite culture is there. Now, Zoroastrianism, as we already said before, is difficult to place. Let's say that it is in Sistan, and that it develops from 1200 BC or 1000 BC or whatever you want. I mean, I think something in that order. I think you should add to that a third factor. When do speakers of Iranian arrive in the Western Iranian plateau? And then as far as we know, that is not long before 1000 BC, maybe even later. So from about 1000 BC, you have to reckon, first of all, with an exchange between speakers of Iranian and the Elamite culture that coexist, and maybe also between Zoroastrianism and Elamite religion. Although this is a question about the migration of Zoroastrianism, which is difficult to answer. So in a period of maybe 500 years, these early Persians or Proto-Persians, they coexist with Elamites. So, I mean, regardless of which direction you want to think, it is only natural to suppose that there has been an exchange between the two. It must be. It must be. And also I should add that these early Persians, whatever their religion and culture, they did not write. They adopted writing from the Elamites, and this is exactly the reason why Darius, for the Byzantine inscription, chose Elamites, and why these tablets from Persepolis are written in Elamite. That is how Persians learned to express themselves in writing. This is how you did it in their part of the world. And I should again add something to that. Writing is something abstract, and you don't adopt abstract things. You don't go to your neighbor and say, I want writing, but otherwise I don't want anything to do with you. So when you borrow writing, when you borrow scripts from a neighboring culture, it is usually part of a package. And this package includes, for instance, the use of seals. It includes bureaucracy, hierarchies, protocols, and many aspects of urban culture. And maybe also more cultural aspects in the direction of religion. And it doesn't have to be a particular god, although it can be. And it doesn't have to be a particular prayer or ritual, although it can be. But it is also the way religion is embedded in the state and in economy, which in ancient Iran is an important thing. It is also, for instance, the experience with the landscape, which for the Elamites was the same landscape as it was for the Iranians. Think of that. Think of Nakhsha-Rustam, which is a sacred site for the Achaemenids, but it was also for the Sasanians, but it was also for the Elamites. There is an Elamite sanctuary at Nakhsha-Rustam. And it was fully visible for the Achaemenids when they built their tombs there. It was already a sacred site. So this mere continuity of the site as a sacred site is important, I would say. You see, so I think we should be modest. At least I should be very modest, because nobody can have complete competence over all these different aspects. But I think there's not one black and white answer to this question that is coming back again and again. I think what we should conclude, if anything, is that the forum that we're talking about, the cultural matrix, if you want, has different strands, and these strands were in contact, and from this contact you have multiple experiences and multiple phenomena and multiple results. And I think that is the playing field, that is the study material on which we should work for the coming years and probably generations to come.
All right, at this point, I'm afraid we have to wrap it up now. I want to thank again Wouter for his inspiring talk, for his work, and I think if we can take one thing away also, that in ancient Iran, the mountains, the rivers were sacred, and I wish we would continue this also, to keep the nature sacred. There's one more question? Okay, good, we can.
So my question is very simple. In your research of Advent, are there any references to agricultural cycles, period of food shortages and famine? And if so, how the imperial system resolved during this vast imperial life this problem?
Yes, there's a lot of reference to the agriculture. And there is indirect references to such things as famine, because then the prices go up. So if there's a bad harvest of barley, the price of barley will go up, and we do have that. And we do see that the government, the centralized state, tries to control the situation, first by imposing prices, you know, that states try to do this all the time, and secondly by diverting, in the sense that they no longer pay rations to workers in barley, but they give them silver and say, you go buy your own barley. And then, of course, not knowing that the workers will not be able to buy the same amount of barley with that silver, but sort of divesting themselves from the problem. So that you see that they go left and right to control it. But generally, they were doing quite well. And they had yield factors for grain that were commonly around 10. So for every liter of barley that they would sow, they would get 10 back, and sometimes 15. And in the ancient world, that was very good. Ancient Greece or Rome never had this, for instance. But they had very good soils, they had very good irrigation, and they had a lot of people to work for them. So I hope that, but I know that where your interest lies, and I could talk for hours with you about what's in terms of agriculture. Yeah.
So I think we should give a round of applause for Wouter. If I also may, I want to say great thank you again to Anne and to Sakir for really